My name is Andy. I'm a very grateful, recovered, but definitely not cured alcoholic. And this week we are into Bill's story, chapter 1, page 1. And we're going to crack straight through this because there's a lot to go through. I'm going to try and do this in 2 weeks if we possibly can, which means covering about 8 pages tonight and 8 pages next week. The first 8 pages of Bill's story are all about the problem, but we will leave on a high note, I promise you that. And then the second 8 pages are really about his journey and the real solution with this. Thank you, Skittles, for going crazy. So, here we go. War fever ran high in the New England town to which we new young officers from Plattsburgh were assigned, and we were flattered when the first citizens took us to their homes, making us feel heroic. Here was love, applause, war, moments sublime with intervals hilarious. I was part of life at last, and in the midst of the excitement, I discovered liquor. So what we're talking about here is Bill's first drink. When he's talking about war fever running high, we're talking about the First World War, which was 1914 to 1918. The time that Bill's referring to here is 1917, because that was when he was stationed in New Bedford, Massachusetts, awaiting to be shipped off to England. So he discovers his first drink, which would have been a Bronx cocktail. And I know you're all alky, so you all want to know what's in that, don't you? Gin, sweet vermouth, dry vermouth, and orange juice. Yeah, sounds horrendous, doesn't it? But by 1930s, that was the number 3 best-selling national cocktail in the United States. Probably because Bill was drinking them. I forgot the strong warnings and the prejudices of my people concerning drink. In time, we sailed for over there being England, where he would be stationed and then shipped off to France to the battlefield. I was very lonely and again turned to alcohol. We landed in England. I visited Winchester Cathedral. Much moved, I wandered outside. My attention was caught by a doggerel on an old tombstone. And I've got a little visual aid for you tonight. Here we go. I can show you the tombstone or a copy. It's been replaced a couple of times historically, but one of those should be. There it is. I share my screen. There we go, and we can spotlight my screen, I think, somehow. I can't remember how you do that. Anyway, but on there you will see the tombstone that Bill would have read. It was a tombstone from 1764. The version he would have looked at was the one that was a copy of it, made in 1802, as is mentioned at the bottom. It's been replaced again since. And there is the full inscription. There are a couple of lines he missed out here, probably for good reason and probably because they weren't all that relevant. But the thing from this is, let's go on and read what the inscription on the old tombstone said. So much my attention was caught by a doggerel, which means a verse, on an old tombstone. Here lies a Hampshire grenadier who caught his death drinking cold small beer. A good soldier is never forgot, whether he dieth by musket or by pot. Ominous warning which I failed to heed. And it roughly translated, if you go back to old English, here's a soldier, we'll break that down, that's how Hampshire Grenadier is, a soldier that died from drinking cold small beer. The truth is that most soldiers drank cold small beers back then, but that's another story. A good soldier, this is the key bit, is never forgot, whether he dieth by musket or by pot. Musket, dying heroically in war and battle. By pot, in the 1700s, was used to refer to anything such as natural causes or poisoning. Quite often poisoning, the pot being the pot the food or the drink was prepared in. So a good soldier, never forgotten, whether they die by that. And obviously in this case, Bill's alluding to the fact that it was the alcohol that took this guy out. An ominous warning which he failed to heed. 22, and a veteran of foreign wars, I went home at last. I fancied myself a leader. For had not the men of my battery given me a special token of appreciation? My talent for leadership, I imagined, would place me at the head of vast enterprises, which I would manage with the utmost assurance. I took a night law course. So we're at the top of page 2, and this takes place 1921 to 1924, the bit we're reading now. I took a night law course and obtained employment as an investigator for a surety company. The drive for success was on. I'd proved to the world I was important. My work took me about Wall Street, and little by little I became interested in the market. Many people lost money, but some became very rich. Why not I? I studied economics and business as well as law. Potential alcoholic that I was, I nearly failed my law course. At one of the finals I was too drunk to think or write. Though my drinking was not yet continuous, it disturbed my wife. So that's the first reference we get to Lois there. We had long talks when I would still her forebodings by telling her that men of genius conceived their best projects when drunk, that the most majestic constructions of philosophic thought were so derived. And that's a delusion that I used in my alcoholism as well. Yeah, I do my best work when I'm drunk. And incidentally, it says there that he nearly failed his law thing. He did eventually go back, redo that exam and pass, but in true alcoholic style, in those days you had to pick up your certificate in person to graduate, and he never bothered. So there you go. By the time I had completed the course, I knew law was not for me. That's probably why I didn't bother picking up a certificate. The inviting maelstrom of Wall Street had me in its grip. Business and financial leaders were my heroes. Out of this alloy of drink and speculation, I commenced to forge the weapon that one day would turn its fight like a boomerang and all but cut me to ribbons. Living modestly, my wife and I saved $1,000, and obviously, it depends how you adjust it, but roughly adjusted for inflation and averaging out with inflation calculators, that would be like saving 20 grand a day. That gives you some idea. And that went into certain securities, stocks and shares. Then cheap and rather unpopular, so probably penny stocks. I rightly imagined that they would someday have a great rise. I failed to persuade my broker friends to send me out looking over factories and managements, but my wife and I decided to go anyway. I had developed a theory that most people lost money in stocks through ignorance of markets. I discovered many more reasons later on. We gave up our positions and off we roared on a motorcycle, and it was a nice bike. It was a Harley Davidson. There are pictures of it. It had a sidecar stuffed with a tent, blankets, a change of clothes, and 3 huge volumes of financial reference service. Our friends thought for a lunacy commission should be appointed. Perhaps they were right. I had some success at speculation, so we had a little money. But we once worked on a farm for a month to avoid drawing on our small capital. That was the last honest manual labour of my part for many a day. We covered the whole eastern United States in a year. At the end of it, my reports to Wall Street procured me a position there and the use of a large expense account. Uh-oh, we know where that's going to go, don't we? The exercise of an option brought in more money, leaving us with profit for several $1,000s that year. For the next few years, fortune threw money and applause my way. And so now we're talking, the next paragraphs we're reading are 1926 to 1929, if you're trying to timeline this out. I had arrived. My judgment and ideas were followed by the tune of paper millions. The great boom of the late 20s was seething and swelling. Drink was taking an important and exhilarating part in my life. There was loud talk in the jazz places uptown. What was Bill doing in the jazz places uptown if he's a broker in the city? Well, prohibition in this time in America, and the only places you could get alcohol, if you didn't just do it at home, were the jazz places, the bars that worked in Prohibition. It's interesting, if you think Bill drank from 1917 to 1934, most of that was in America. Only 2 years of that would have been legal drinking, without when Prohibition wasn't in effect. Everyone spent in thousands and chattered in millions. Scoffers could scoff and be damned. I made a host of fair weathered friends, and I think we've all had our fair share of those, haven't we? People that are only really our friends because we drank with them. My drinking assumed more serious proportions, continuing all day and almost every night. The remonstrances of my friends, I had to look that word up, it means protests. The protests of my friends terminated in a row, and I became a lone wolf. There were many unhappy scenes in our sumptuous apartment. And Bill and Lois were living in luxury situations there. When he said sumptuous, they had 2 apartments. They had one, it wasn't enough. They got the one next to it and knocked through. So they were living in 2 apartments made into one. Bill was making good money here. There had been no real infidelity, for loyalty to my wife, helped at times by extreme drunkenness, kept me out of those scrapes. In 1929, I contracted golf fever. We went at once to the country, my wife to applaud while I started to overtake Walter Hagen. He was a world-famous golfer. In actual fact, still I think, and I'm not a golf fanatic, but still I think ranked the world number 3 after Jack Nicklaus and Tiger Woods today, even in today's times. But he's making reference to, I was getting good at golf and comparing himself to a great like Walter Hagen, which is obviously a little bit of sarcasm in there. Liquor caught up with me much faster than I came up behind Walter. I began to be jittery in the morning. More progression here, you see. Golf permitted drinking every day and every night. It was fun to caroom around the exclusive course which had inspired such awe in me as a lad. I acquired the impeccable coat of tan one sees upon the well-to-do. The local banker watched me whirl fat checks in and out of his till with amused scepticism. Abruptly, in October 1929, hell broke loose on the New York Stock Exchange. After one of those days of inferno, I wobbled from a hotel bar to a brokerage office. It was 8 o'clock, 5 hours after the market closed. The ticker still clattered. I was staring at an inch of the tape which bore the inscription XYZ, or Z if you're American, -32. That's obviously not a real stock thing. Bill made that up to cover what it really is. It's not important what it was. It was Penwick and Ford, if you really want to know. They were a syrup company, and syrup was the thing Bill knew a lot about. It had been 52 that morning. So it had dropped 20 points, basically. I was finished, and so were many friends. And why were they finished? Because they bought this stock on what's called margin. They effectively borrow the money to buy the stock drops that much, then the people that have lent you the money pull the rug out from under your feet on what's called a margin call, and then at the end of the day, you not only have got nothing, you now owe all that debt. The papers reported men jumping to death from the towers of high finance. That disgusted me. I would not jump. I went back to the bar. My friends had dropped several million since 10 o'clock. I mean, that would be like dropping 120, 150 million today. So what? Tomorrow was another day as I drank. The old fierce determination to win came back. Next morning I telephoned a friend in Montreal. He had plenty of money left and thought I had better go to Canada. And this is a guy called Dick Johnson, who ran Greenshield & Co., a brokerage company out in Canada. By the following spring, we were living in our accustomed style. In other words, we got all the riches back, all the good stuff back. I felt like Napoleon returning from Elba. No St. Helena or Helena, depending on, again, where you're from, how you pronounce it, for me. That comparison there, Napoleon was held prisoner in 2 places, Elba, which he escaped from quite victoriously, and St. Helena, where I believe he actually just died. He didn't get out, and I believe he died there. But drinking caught up with me again, and my generous friend had to let me go. This time we stayed broke. We went to live with my wife's parents, that's Dr. and Mrs. Burnham. I found a taxi job and then lost it as a result of a brawl with a taxi driver. Mercifully, no one can guess that I was to have no real employment for 5 years or hardly draw a sober breath. My wife began to work in a department store, coming home exhausted to find me drunk. So we know that was 1931 to 1934 that Lois worked for Macy's. I became an unwelcomed hanger-on at brokerage places. Liquor ceased to be a luxury, it became a necessity. Once again, I think we've all been there, haven't we? Many of us. It's gone from that being a luxury thing to something we have to do. This is the progression again, more progression. Bathtub gin. 2 bottles a day and often 3 got to be a routine. And bathtub gin, back in the days of Prohibition again, bathtub gin, and there are a couple of definitions, both of which are true. So one was that this wasn't brewed in a bathtub. It was still done in a still, and it was made to be very strong. So they would distill it down to 90%, and then they would put that much, a small amount, in a big bottle and send you away with it, and you would dilute it down yourself. Now, some people did actually mix it in a bathtub with spices and other things, and that's part of where the name came from. But the other one was that you couldn't get these bottles in the sink to fill them up with the water to dilute that gin down, but you could fit them under the tap of a bathtub. And so that was the other place. That's the two places that we get the term bathtub gin from. And basically, strong alcohol that you watered down so it wouldn't kill you. Not very nice, but that was what they drank during Prohibition. Sometimes a small deal would net a few $100s, and I would pay my bills at the bars and delicatessens. This went on endlessly, and I began to waken very early in the morning, shaking violently. A tumbler of gin followed by half a dozen bottles of beer would be required if I were to eat any breakfast. Nevertheless, I could still control the situation, and there were periods of sobriety which renewed my wife's hope. Once again, more self-will attempts, right? Gradually, things got worse. The house was taken over by the mortgage broker. My mother-in-law died. My wife and father-in-law became ill. Then I got a promising business opportunity. Stocks were at a low point of 1932, and I had somehow formed a group to buy. I was to share generously in the profits. Then I went on a prestigious bender, and the chance vanished. And the story behind that is Bill got together with a few people, and they said, Bill, we can't work with you. You're going to get drunk. We don't want to risk that. And he said they made a contract, and the contract was that if Bill had so much as a single drink, he was out of that deal. And the deal was all going well, and then what happens? He has a drink and loses that whole deal. So that's what happened there. I woke up. This had to be stopped. I saw I could not take so much as one drink. I was through forever. Not the first time he said that, won't be the last. Before then, I'd written lots of sweet promises, but my wife happily observed that this time I meant business, and so I did. And the sweet promises he talks about there are promises he wrote to Lois in the family Bible. And if you want to read about them, look in the AA book, Pass It On, pages 81 to 86, goes through those. Shortly afterward, I came home drunk. There had been no fight. Where had been my high resolve? I simply didn't know. It hadn't even come to my mind. Someone had pushed a drink my way and I'd taken it. Was I crazy? I began to wonder, for such an appalling lack of perspective seemed near being just that. Renewing my resolve, I tried again. Note the I in there, eh? Self-will again. He tries again. We know that isn't going to work when we find out that it doesn't. Some time passed and confidence began to be replaced by cocksureness. I could laugh at the gin mills. Now I had what it takes. One day I walked into a cafe to telephone. In those days they didn't have mobile phones, right? You had to go into cafes and bars and they had payphones. In no time I was beating on the bar asking myself how it happened. So goes into a place to make a phone call, ends up drunk. Didn't intend to drink, but does. As the whiskey rose to my head, I told myself I would manage better next time. But I might as well get good and drunk then, and I did. And I'm sure we've all been there with alcohol. Oh, it's got you now. Might as well make the most of it. That's what our alcoholic heads will tell us. This was in 1932, by the way, if you're still trying to fit out the timeline of things. The remorse, horror and hopelessness of the next morning are unforgettable. The courage to do battle was not there. My brain raced uncontrollably, and there was a terrible sense of impending calamity. I hardly dare cross the street, lest I collapse and be run down by an early morning truck. For it was scarcely daylight. An all-night place supplied me with a dozen glasses of ale. My writhing nerves were stilled at last. A morning paper told me the market had gone to hell again. Well, so had I. The market would recover, but I wouldn't. That was a hard thought. Should I kill myself? No. Not now. Then a mental fog settled down. Gin would fix that. So 2 bottles and oblivion. The mind and the body are marvellous mechanisms. For mine endured this agony 2 more years. Sometimes I stole from my wife's slender purse when the morning terror and madness were on me. Again I swayed dizzily before an open window or the medicine cabinet where there was poison, cursing myself for a weakling. There were flights from city to country and back, so they tried the geographic thing as well that many of us have tried, as my wife and I sought escape. Then came the night when the physical and mental torture was so hellish I feared I would burst through the window, sash and all. Somehow I managed to drag my mattress to a lower floor lest I suddenly leap. A doctor came with a heavy sedative. Next day found me drinking both gin and sedative. This combination soon landed me on the rocks. People feared for my sanity, so did I. Once again, more progression, right? I could eat little or nothing when drinking, and I was 40 pounds underweight. And I'll tell you what, I've seen photos of Bill. He was a stick of a dude, right? He couldn't afford to be 40 pound underweight. So, that was a rough place for him to be in. My brother-in-law is a physician. This is a guy called Dr. Strong. And through his kindness and that of my mother, I was placed in a nationally known hospital for the mental and physical rehabilitation of alcoholics. Under the so-called belladonna treatment, my brain cleared. Hydrotherapy and mild exercise helped much. Best of all, I met a kind doctor who explained that though certainly selfish and foolish, I had been seriously ill, bodily and mentally. So this is his first visit into Towns Hospital, where he meets Dr. Silkworth in 1933, who is the doctor that explains the difference and the fact that it's bodily and mental, which was something pretty revolutionary as a thought back then. It relieved me somewhat to learn in alcoholics that the will is amazingly weakened when it comes to combating liquor, though it often remains strong in other respects. My incredible behaviour in the face of a desperate desire to stop was explained. Understanding myself now, I fared forth in high hope. For 3 or 4 months the goose hung high. I went to town regularly and even made a little money. Surely this was the answer. Self-knowledge. But it was not. For the frightful day came when I drank once more. The curve of my declining moral and bodily health fell off like a ski jump, and after a time I returned to the hospital. And that was in July of 1934, and we know that because there are copies of the receipts in the archives. This was the finish, the curtain, it seemed to me. My weary and despairing wife was informed that it would all end with heart failure during delirium tremens, or I would develop a wet brain, perhaps within a year. She would soon have to give me over to the undertaker or the asylum. And that's one of the shocking things about alcohol. If you come off it, you can get these things called delirium tremens. This is why we tell people, if you get shakes and get a detox, get medical help. Alcohol is the only drug that I'm aware of that you can die in the coming off it process. Other drugs, you go for a hell of a time, but you've only got a low % chance of actually dying from coming off them. Alcohol has got quite a high chance if you're at that stage. They did not need to tell me. I knew and almost welcomed the idea. It was a devastating blow to my pride. I, who had thought so well of myself and my abilities, of my capacity to surmount obstacles, was cornered at last. Now I was plunged into the dark. Now, somewhere between this word now and the word trembling in the next paragraph is a third visit to the hospital. So now I was to plunge into the dark, joining that endless progression of sots who had gone on before. I thought of my poor wife. There had been much happiness after all. What would I not give to make amends? But that was over now. No words can tell of the loneliness and despair I found in that bitter morass of self-pity. Quicksand stretched around me in all directions. I had met my match. I had been overwhelmed. Alcohol was my master. Trembling, I stepped from the hospital. So we know he's been in the hospital a third time, and that third stint was September 1934. I stepped from the hospital a broken man. Fear sobered me for a bit. Then came the insidious insanity of that first drink. And then on Armistice Day of 1934, so that's November 11th, 1934, I was off again. Everyone became resigned to the certainty that I would have to be shut up somewhere or would stumble along to a miserable end. How dark it is before the dawn. In reality, that was the beginning of my last debauch. I was soon to be catapulted into what I like to call the fourth dimension of existence. And back then, that was looked at as anything outside of the ordinary, an experience outside of time and things like that. And I'm sure those of us that have been rocketed into that dimension also know just how difficult it is to try and quantify to someone that hasn't been what it's like. But I was to know happiness, peace and usefulness in a way of life that is incredibly more wonderful as time passes. Promised we'd ended on a high. That way we can start next week with Ebby's visit to Bill. And I look forward to hearing what you've got to share back on that. You've got to come back next week and find out what happens, haven't you?